He died buried under 20 meters of rock in a uranium mine. When he woke up, he found himself in a hall the size of a football field, where a blue screen informed him that his former world no longer existed. 10,000 other dead souls were choosing their own golden lands with rivers and forests. He chose the ashes. Caden Worth clutches his pickaxe in his hand. That very one, with the broken handle. A second ago, he was lying under the rubble in an old mine in Arizona. He remembers the roof crashing down. He remembers pushing his partner out from under the rubble. He remembers the light on his helmet going out. And now he stands in the middle of the crowd, and the blue interface hangs before his eyes like a hologram from a cheap movie. The system says he is dead, that the planet Arion welcomes the new chosen one. Caden blinks. The pickaxe is real. The calluses on his palm are real. So everything else must be real too. The interface unfolds a map of the world. Each sector glows in colors ranging from gold to gray. Gold represents rivers, forests, fertile land, and confirmed deposits of ether. Gray is the wastelands, ash, rock, zero water, zero resources, zero life. A girl in a dress made of fresh flowers snatches the Valley of the Seven Rivers. The hall hums with approval. A guy in an $80,000 suit takes the Golden Coast. Logical, beautiful, safe. And Caden points his finger at the gray spot in the corner. Sector 001. The biggest, the deadest, the cheapest by every measure. He clicks. And that's when the strangest thing happens. The room falls silent for a second, then bursts into laughter. 10,000 people are laughing at the guy in the dusty shirt who picked the worst patch on the planet. And Caden smiles. They laughed just as hard at that bar in Tucson when he bought a plot from an old Navajo. 6 months later, he extracted 4 kilograms of native gold from that plot. The interface flashes and implants a skill into him. Subsurface X-ray, rank X. The system couldn't even fit him into a single category. A layer-by-layer scan 1.5 kilometers deep, reading the age of the rock, the tactile memory of the earth. Everything he's known how to do with his hands for 30 years now works like a program. The world flickers, and Caden stands alone in the middle of a gray plain under a sky the color of old lead. Ash lies in a thick layer like snow, which never falls here. The air smells of sulfur and burnt stone. No wind, no sound. In his inventory, a pickaxe, a sack of oats, 3 bottles of water, and that's it. He crouches down, scoops up a handful of ash and rubs it between his fingers. Volcanic, thousands of years of aging. Clay beneath the ash, sandstone beneath the clay, and something else beneath the sandstone. His skill kicks in on its own. The earth unfolds before him in layers. The first 100 meters are dead. 200, 300. At 400, he picks up the first anomaly, a lens of ancient water trapped between 2 layers of shale. Dead, mineralized to the limit, but water. At 700, the second, a layer of rock 10,000 years old that doesn't fit into the history of the area. Too even, too perfect, as if someone had laid it there on purpose. Caden wipes the blood from his lip. His nose started running at 800 meters. The deeper you look, the longer it takes for your eyes to go blind. But he has already seen it. 1 kilometer deep beneath this dead plain lies something enormous, something glowing, something alive. He doesn't yet know that it is the ether. He doesn't know that the whole world runs on it like a gasoline engine. He doesn't know that 10 corporations control 80% of production and kill for every liter. But he knows the main thing. Everyone looks at the surface and sees ash, and he looked down and saw light. He spends his first night in a crevice between boulders, chewing raw oats. He coughs from the ash. 1 kilometer below him, something is pulsing, slowly, steadily, like the heartbeat of the earth everyone thought was dead. He places his palm on the rock and feels that pulse through the stone. Warm, real. In the morning, he nearly dies. Not from a monster, not from an enemy, from dehydration. 2 bottles gone overnight. The third is the last. Without water, he'll last a day, maybe 2. His sense of sight is silent after yesterday's deep scan. Blindness. So we'll have to work with our hands. Caden gets up and heads northeast, not at random. Yesterday, 400 meters away, he saw that lens of water and microcracks in the layer above it. If the cracks reach the surface, there will be moisture. 3 hours through the ash, and he finds a rock with dark spots on the north side. Moisture. Barely noticeable, but lichen is growing on the stone. Caden strikes with his pickaxe, the right angle, the right spot. He's not hitting the rock, but the weak spot between the layers. 40 minutes, and a thin trickle flows from the crack. Rusty, with a taste of iron, but water. He fills a bottle, lets it settle. He takes a sip. It's drinkable. He can live. The interface flashes. Water source detected. Territory status updated. Caden sits down next to the spring and exhales for the first time in 2 days. He looks out at the gray plain, at the ash, at the leaden sky, at the complete absence of life as far as the eye can see. And he speaks aloud his first words since arriving. All right, let's start here. Caden spent the first 10 days in survival mode. He didn't build, he didn't plan, he didn't think about the kingdom. He thought about how not to die. The spring yielded 1.5 liters of water per hour. That was enough for drinking and soaking oats. The pickaxe became his main tool. He carved out a niche in the rock to sleep in. Then he expanded it into a cave. Then he found a second water source 100 meters to the south. This one was cleaner. His ability was returning slowly. On the 3rd day, he could see 10 meters deep again. On the 5th, up to 50. By the 8th, he could scan 300 meters without bleeding. His body had adapted, or his ability had leveled up, or both. Every morning he placed his palm on the ground and read it like a book. On the 6th day, he found a deposit of clay suitable for firing. On the 7th day, the bed of a dried-up river 50 meters beneath the sandstone. On the 9th, a pocket of rock salt. He marked everything in his mind. The map of the wastelands unfolded before him layer by layer, and it had nothing in common with what the system showed. The system saw the surface, dead ash and stone. Caden saw the skeleton, the bones of ancient living earth beneath a crust of millennia-old debris. On the 10th day, he built his first kiln. Clay, stones, a primitive framework of rock fragments. He fired the first bricks on the 4th try. Crooked, rough, but the bricks held the heat and didn't crumble in the water. He began building a wall around the spring, not for protection, for condensation. The wall created shade, and the shade on the hot earth created a temperature difference. The temperature difference produced dew. The dew provided an extra 200 milliliters of water per day. On the 12th day, Hiram appeared. Caden heard him before he saw him, shuffling footsteps on the ash, a cough, the heavy, raspy breathing of a man whose lungs were clogged with black dust. The old man emerged from the gray haze like a ghost, 60-something years old, a gray beard down to his waist, clothes reduced to rags. On his back, a sack from which the broken handle of a miner's hammer jutted out. He stopped by the wall. He looked at the spring. He looked at the furnace. He looked at Caden, who was sitting on a rock, chipping away at a brick. And he said he'd been walking here for 4 days from a village on the border of the wastelands. That the village was dying out, that the ether was gone and people had nothing to treat their children with, that he'd heard some madman had taken over the wastelands and that he'd come to see this madman. Caden silently handed him a bottle of water. Hiram sat down. He drank long and thirstily. Then he looked at the wall and the condensation system and asked who had taught him that. Caden replied that it was the Nevada desert and common sense. Hiram nodded as if that were a perfectly normal answer. Then he told his story. 30 years ago, he had worked in a mine 20 kilometers from here, a crew of 40 men. They were extracting the last remnants of ether from old veins. There was a cave-in. Everyone died except him and 2 guys who were on the surface. His son, Joss, was left down there. He was 17. They never recovered the body because the cost of digging him out exceeded what anyone was willing to pay for the bones of a miner's boy. Hiram told this in an even voice. No tears, no tremor. The voice of a man who had cried over this for 30 years and had dried up inside like these wastelands. Caden listened in silence. Then he stood up. He said he wanted to check. Hiram led him to an old mine shaft, a 2-hour walk across the gray plain. The shaft looked like a hole in the ground framed by rotten logs, collapsed, clogged with rock, dead. Caden crouched on the edge. He placed his palm on the stone. He closed his axe. The skill activated gently. Layers of rock unfolded before him like pages. The first 100 meters, a blockage, dense, clay and rubble and fragments of support. At 120 meters, emptiness, an old workings, no air, no water. At 150, another blockage. At 200, a denser one. At 220, he saw them. Bones. Lots of bones. At least 20 bodies crushed by a layer of shale. They lay haphazardly in a side tunnel where they had apparently tried to flee. Caden was looking for one specific person. 17 years old, skinny, must be shorter than the rest. 220 meters, south-southeast, under a layer of shale, left side. An iron canteen and a piece of support near him. He found him. Caden opened his eyes, wiped the blood from his upper lip, looked at Hiram and said his son was 220 meters away, south-southeast, lying on his left side, a flask and a support beam nearby, and that he'd pull him out, today. Hiram stood motionless. He didn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. 30 years. Caden didn't try to convince him. He took a pickaxe and began to count. 220 meters in a straight line, through the debris. Impossible.
But not in a straight line, but at an angle through the old side tunnel he'd seen 120 meters away, they could get around the first debris pile, then a horizontal passage to the second. The second debris pile was thin, 3 meters of loose rock. It could be broken through in an hour if struck at the right spot. He explained the plan to Hiram. The old man listened with the expression of someone being told a dream. But when Caden crawled into the shaft, Hiram followed him. 6 hours. 6 hours in the darkness underground with a single pickaxe and a skill that revealed every crack in the rock. Caden worked like a machine. Not fast, but precise. Every strike a millimeter from the calculated point. Every step checked by scanning 10 meters ahead. Hiram followed him and hauled out the rock. He didn't complain. He didn't ask questions. He just worked like a miner. By the 5th hour, they had broken through the second blockage. By the 6th, Caden stood before what remained of 37 people. Bones, dust, decayed fabric, and among them, a short skeleton on its left side, an iron flask nearby, a piece of support timber nearby. Next to it, a locket on a chain. Caden picked up the locket. He opened it.
Inside was a photograph, faded almost to white but still recognizable. A woman and a boy of about 5. He held out the locket to Hiram. The old man took it with both hands. He looked at the photograph, and he sank to his knees right into the gray dust. He wept silently, without a sound. Only his shoulders shook. Caden stood nearby and waited. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say the right words. He just stood there. 20 minutes later, they began gathering the bones, carefully, one by one. Caden carried them on his back while Hiram walked ahead with the flask and the medallion pressed to his chest. By the time they made it to the surface, the sun was already setting. Hiram laid his son's bones on the ground and sat down beside them. He sat there in silence for a long time. Then he looked at Caden and said he was staying, that he didn't know who Caden was or where he came from, that he didn't give a damn about the system, the chosen, and this whole world, but that a man who went underground for someone else's bones deserved to have at least someone by his side who knew how to wield a hammer. Caden nodded. The population of Grey Rock was now 2 people. That night, Caden lay in his cave and thought about what had happened. He remembered Hiram's face as he held the medallion, and he understood something he hadn't been able to put into words for 30 years. His gift wasn't about money. The money would come. It was about people whom no one had ever looked for because searching was too expensive. The skill pulsed at the back of his head with a warm pressure. Beneath him, a kilometer deep, a glowing object continued to beat slowly, like a heart, like a promise. The system interface updated. Population 2. Resources, water source. Structures, an oven and a wall. Reputation, 0. Caden closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he would start digging for real. On the 13th day, Caden and Hiram buried Joss. Hiram chose a spot by the cliff with the spring. He said he wanted his son to hear the water. Caden didn't argue. He carved a niche in the rock. He laid the bones inside. He covered it with a slab of fired clay. Hiram hung a medallion on a hook driven into the stone. He stood there for a minute.
Then he turned and said they needed to shore up the cave entrance because he'd heard the ceiling creaking at night.
Caden checked. The old man was right. A micro crack in the cave ceiling. Without his skill, he wouldn't have noticed it for another week. With his skill, he saw it right away. Hiram saw it without any skill at all, just the ear of a miner who had spent 30 years listening to the rock groan. They installed the supports in 2 days. Hiram worked slowly but flawlessly. Every wedge was driven in at the correct angle. Every prop was rated for a ton more than necessary. Caden watched and learned. His knowledge was of the Earth's depths, of what lay below. Hiram knew how to build above ground so that what lay below wouldn't kill you in your sleep. On the 15th day, Caden decided it was time to dig. Not a well, not a cellar, a mine, a real one. He'd spent 2 weeks looking at what lay beneath the wastelands, and now he had a map, not on paper, in his head. 3 levels. The first at a depth of 30 meters, an aquifer. Not the one 400 meters down, a different one, shallow but clean, enough to supply a settlement of 100 people.
The second level at 90 meters, a mineral deposit, not ether, ordinary ores, copper, tin, a little silver, a commercial resource. He hadn't touched the third level yet. The third level was that glowing thing a kilometer deep. Not the time. He wasn't even close to being ready. Caden marked the entrance to the mine. Hiram looked at the markings and shook his head. He said the angle was wrong, that with the shaft at that angle, groundwater would flood the upper levels by spring. Caden double-checked. Hiram was right. The angle needed to be shifted 3 degrees to the east. He adjusted it. They began digging. 2 men, 1 pickaxe, 1 hammer. They hauled out the rock in buckets. Caden had fashioned the buckets from clay and fired them in a kiln. They were ugly and heavy and cracked every other day, but they worked. By the 20th day, the shaft had gone 8 meters down. Caden reinforced the walls as they dug. Every meter, he scanned the rock ahead and to the sides. Not a single surprise, not a single weak spot. Hiram said he hadn't seen such meticulous work in 30 years. Caden replied that meticulousness was the only thing standing between a miner and the grave. On the 23rd day, the shaft reached 20 meters. Caden drove a side tunnel to the water-bearing horizon. Water began flowing at the 24th meter, clean, cold, with a slight mineral taste but no iron or sulfur, drinkable. They brought the water to the surface through a stone trough. The flow was weak but steady, 50 liters a day. Hiram tasted it and said the last time he drank water like this was when he was a child. Caden built a pool, a pit lined with fired bricks, 2 meters by 2, knee-deep, a reservoir in case the spring dried up. It didn't dry up. By the 26th day, there was enough water for Caden to begin his experiment. He took a handful of ash. He rinsed it 3 times, dried it, mixed it with clay from the quarry and rock salt he'd found earlier. It turned into a gray mass. He spread it in a thin layer on a flat rock, poured water from the mine over it, and waited. On the 3rd day, whitish threads began to emerge from the gray mass. Moss, or something like moss. Life. The first life on the surface of the wastelands in 1,000 years. Hiram stood over that stone and was silent for a minute.
Then he said that Caden was crazy,
and that he had done the right thing by staying.
The 29th day. Caden was digging the lower horizon of the mine, 90 meters. Copper ore started at 86. The vein was thin but steady, pure copper, free of arsenic impurities, a rarity even by the standards of his former world. He cut out the first samples, 3 pieces the size of a fist. The copper glinted in the lantern light like a new coin. Caden brought the samples to the surface. Hiram turned a piece over in his hands and said that in the nearest trading they'd pay a good price for copper like this. Not a fortune, but enough for tools and cloth and decent food. Caden nodded. It was time to go out into the world. The 30th day. They were heading east toward the border of the Wastelands. Hiram knew the way, 8 hours on foot across the gray plain. By evening, the ash beneath their feet had grown thinner. Then sand appeared, then yellow clay, then the first stunted grass. The border of the Wastelands looked like a line drawn across the earth by a giant's hand. On one side, death, on the other, a meager life. The trading settlement was called Rainhold. 300 residents, 2 taverns, a market,
A money changer's stall. A small garrison of 10 soldiers belonging to the local baron. People eyed them warily. 2 filthy, ragged strangers from the Wastelands. Nothing new. Others like them had come before. Usually they asked for food. Sometimes they stole. Caden entered the money changer's shop. He placed 3 pieces of copper on the table. The money changer picked up 1 piece. He looked at it. He turned it over. He bit off a corner. His eyes widened. He asked where it came from. Caden replied that it came from the ground. The money changer offered 20 silver pieces for the 3 pieces. Caden said 40. The money changer laughed. Caden said that copper of this purity was worth 60, but he was new to this world and willing to settle for 40 out of respect. The money changer stopped laughing. He looked more. He asked how a stranger from the wastes knew the prices of ore. Caden replied that it was his job. They settled on 35. Caden bought a rope, 2 buckets, standard ones, iron, a sack of grain, a sack of dried meat, a skein of cloth, a flint, and a small copper pot. Hiram carried half. On the way back, the old man asked why Caden had haggled the price down. He knew the real value. He could have demanded 60. Caden replied that he would return to this money changer 100 more times, and that a man who had been fleeced the first time would bargain with hatred the second time. And he didn't want hatred. He wanted a regular customer. Hiram grunted and said that for a miner, Caden thought too much. Caden replied that that was exactly why he was still alive. Day 31, morning. Caden stood at the edge of the mine shaft and looked down. Today he was going to do something he hadn't done since day 1. Look really deep. He placed both palms on the rock, closed his eyes, and dove. 100 meters, 200, 300. The copper vein was left behind. 400, a lens of water. 500, 600, an ancient layer. The very one, too smooth, too perfect. 700. Blood started flowing from his nose. He didn't stop. 800, 900, 1,000. It was here, a vein. But not just a vein, a river. An underground river of liquid light. It flowed from north to south at a depth of 1,100 meters, as wide as a highway, as bright as molten gold. And it pulsed, evenly, slowly, as if alive. Caden stared at it and his hands trembled, not from fear, from the scale. It was bigger than any deposit he had ever seen in his entire life, bigger than all the deposits he had ever seen in his entire life, all of them combined. He unclenched his hands, opened his eyes. Blood was flowing from his nose, down his lip, over his chin, dripping onto the rock. His head was buzzing. His vision was blurry. Hiram stood beside him, holding his shoulder. Caden said one sentence to him. "There's a whole sea beneath us." The system interface flashed. Resource detected, primordial ether.
Territory status updated. A global notification regarding the new ether supplier had been sent. Caden didn't yet know that everyone had seen this notification. All 10,000 of the chosen, all 10 of the great corporations, all the kings and dukes and barons and merchants and mercenaries of Arion. He didn't know that in 16 days, the first spy would appear at the borders of his land, that in a month, the first delegation would arrive with a chest of gold, that in 2 months, they would try to kill him.
He stood at the edge of the mine with blood on his face, thinking of only one thing: how to reach that river of light without killing himself along the way. For the first 3 days after discovering the vein, Caden did not go down into the mine. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't see deeper than a meter. Blindness after deep scanning. The expected price. He used that time to think. He sat at the cave entrance and sketched drilling diagrams in the ashes with a stick. 1,100 meters down. A vertical shaft of that depth is suicide for 2 men with a single pickaxe. The rock pressure on the lower levels would crush any support they could set up from whatever materials they had on hand. They needed a different strategy. Caden drew and erased and drew again. Hiram sat nearby, silently smoking a pipe filled with dried moss. The moss smelled disgusting, but the old man said it made it easier to breathe. By evening of the second day, Caden had found a solution. Not a vertical shaft, a spiral one. A gentle, circular descent along the walls of a natural cavern he'd spotted 500 meters away. The cavern was enormous, 50 meters in diameter. A void inside the rock formed millions of years ago as the rock cooled. If we use its walls as a supporting structure, we'll only need to reinforce the passageway. Instead of a 1,000-meter vertical shaft, we'll end up with a 3-kilometer spiral tunnel, longer but safer. And they'd be able to lower cargo on a cart instead of a rope. Hiram listened to the plan and said it would work, but that the two of them wouldn't be able to dig it out in 10 years. Caden replied that they didn't have to dig the whole thing themselves. They just needed to dig to the cavern, 500 meters. The rest could be finished when people showed up. Hiram asked where the people would come from. Caden looked at the horizon and said that people show up where there's water and work. They had both. The news will spread. On the 4th day, his strength returned. Caden went back into the mine and began driving a new tunnel, southwest direction, 5-degree incline, a slow, gentle descent. He worked 12-hour shifts. Hiram worked 8. His lungs wouldn't allow for more. Caden had learned to sense when the old man was getting tired by the way he struck the hammer. The blows became slightly duller, slightly slower, slightly to the right. Then Caden would say he needed to go up for water, and Hiram would go with him. They never discussed that it was an excuse. They both knew. By the 35th day, the tunnel had extended 12 meters from the main shaft. By the 38th, 20. The rock here was different. Dense gray sandstone that held its shape well and didn't crumble. Caden set supports every 3 meters, but more for safety's sake. This rock could stand without supports for decades. On the 38th day, a third person arrived at Gray Rock. A girl. Skinny, dirty, with eyes peering out from under her hood like a cornered animal. She didn't approach. She sat on a rock 300 meters from the camp and watched. Caden noticed her when he climbed out of the shaft. He said nothing. That evening, he left a bowl of porridge at the edge of the camp. In the morning, the bowl was empty. He left another one. Hiram asked why he was feeding someone he couldn't even see. Caden replied that he could see her, that she was sitting behind a boulder to the west, that she was 16 or 17, that she was a local because she moved through the wastes as if they were her own home, and that if she wanted to steal, she would have stolen by now instead of sitting there watching. Hiram said that Caden thought too highly of people. Caden replied that he thought exactly as much as necessary. The girl came every day. She took a bowl, she left. After a week, she stopped hiding. She started sitting closer. 10 days later, Caden saw her 30 meters from the mine entrance. She was looking at the rock they were pulling out. She walked over, picked up a piece, turned it over, put it back, left. The next day, she brought a handful of stones and placed them by the bowl. Caden looked at the stones.
Flint. High-quality flint for tools. He knew there were no flint deposits nearby. She had found it somewhere in the wastes. So she knows this area better than he does. He placed a piece of dried meat by the bowl, more than usual. He set a second bowl of water next to it, and a note. A simple one. "My name is Caden. Thank you for the flint." By morning, the meat and water were gone. The note was still there, but a single word was scratched on the back. Emma.
On the 50th day, Emma spoke for the first time. She was standing at the entrance to the mine when Caden came up after his shift. She said he was digging in the wrong direction. Caden stopped. He asked which way he should dig. She pointed. "South-southwest. There's a cave there," she said, "a big one. Her father used to take her there when she was little. It's warm down there." Caden froze. He checked the direction in his head. South-southwest. That matched the upper edge of the cavern he'd seen 500 meters away. If the cavern had a natural exit to the surface, that changed everything. No need to break through 500 meters of rock. They just had to find the entrance. He asked Emma to show him. She was silent for a long time, then she nodded. They walked for 2 hours. Emma moved with confidence. She skirted around cracks in the ground and soft patches of ash where one could sink knee-deep. She knew every rock, every crevice, every turn. She led him to a rocky outcrop 3 kilometers from the camp. Behind the outcrop was a crevice, narrow. A person could squeeze through sideways. Caden squeezed inside. Darkness, warm air from below, the smell of minerals, and something sweet that he couldn't identify. He placed his hand on the wall. His instinct kicked in, and Caden laughed. For the first time in 50 days on this planet, he laughed out loud. The cavern was here, right beneath them. A natural shaft dropped almost vertically for 120 meters and then opened into the upper vault of the cave. Not 500 meters of tunneling, 120 meters down the natural shaft, and then further down the cavern to the vein. Emma was standing behind him. She was silent. When he turned to her, she was looking away. He told her she'd just saved him 2 years of work. She shrugged, said she just knew where everything was around here. Her father had been a miner. He'd shown her everything before he died. She didn't say what he'd died of. Caden didn't ask. On the way back, he walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, beside her, like a guide. On the 52nd day in Grey Rock, 2 events occurred. The first, Caden began his descent into the cavern through a natural shaft. He secured the rope to a rock ledge and climbed down with a torch between his teeth. 120 meters of vertical descent down the rock face. His hands were burning. His shoulders were burning. The rope cut into his palms through his gloves. But he made it. The cavern was exactly as he had seen it through his skill. A huge, empty dome inside the mountain. The black basalt walls glistened with moisture. The air was warm and thick. And on the floor of the cavern, in the cracks of the rock, Caden saw it. Light, pale blue, pulsating. Ether. Not the river. Its bed was 600 meters below. But capillaries. Thin threads of liquid light seeping through the rock like tree roots. Ether oozed through the stone, slowly, drop by drop. But even those drops were enough to make the air in the cavern tremble with energy. Caden stood in the center of the dome and felt the skill humming inside his skull. Down here it worked 10 times more powerfully. He could see not a mile, but 3. He could see every thread of ether, every bend in the underground river. And he saw something else. A structure. The river below was not a natural formation. Its bed had been laid out, even, symmetrical, with regular widenings every 200 meters. Someone had built this. 10,000 years ago, someone had dug the channel and filled it with ether. Someone had laid a reservoir at the most toxic spot on the planet, where no one would ever look. The second event. While Caden was down below, Lena Hayes appeared on the surface. Caden had devised a plan for a spiral shaft. Emma gradually emerged from her hiding place and led him to the natural entrance to the cavern at a depth of 120 meters. Caden descended and discovered ether capillaries and traces of an artificial structure in the bed of an underground river.
At the end of the chapter, Lena Hayes appeared at the camp. Lena Hayes arrived in Grey Rock on the 38th day after the system's launch. Hiram was the first to see her. A girl of about 22, skinny, with sunburned shoulders and a torn academic-style cloak. Expensive fabric. It used to be expensive. Now it was a rag. A crystal focuser in a copper setting dangled around her neck, a standard model from the Royal Academy of Magic. Hiram offered her water. She drank 3 mugs without stopping. Then she sat down on a rock and asked if it was true that the Lord of these lands welcomed everyone.
Hiram said that the Lord was underground right now and that he wasn't sure about the word Lord. More like a guy with a pickaxe who digs too much. Lena waited. When Caden climbed out of the well 6 hours later, his face covered in dirt, face and blood under his nose, she stood at the cave entrance and looked at him the way you look at the person on whom your last chance depends. She spoke quickly and angrily, as if she were defending herself, even though no one was attacking her. She said she'd been expelled from the academy 3 years ago for an unstable core, that her body doesn't accept standard synthetic ether, that it makes her run a fever of up to 40 degrees and her hands shake, that she tried working as a hired mage in 3 cities and was fired everywhere because after every spell, she'd be flat on her back for 2 days. That she'd walked to Grey Rock for 2 weeks from the nearest city because she'd heard there was ether here and that the local lord didn't check papers. Caden listened in silence. He stood there, dirty and exhausted, wiping the blood from his face with his sleeve. When she finished, he said he didn't have any papers either. And that there was enough water, and that tomorrow he'd like to check something out if she agreed.
She agreed because she had nowhere else to go. In the morning, Caden asked her to stand on the stone floor of the cave, barefoot. She looked at him strangely, but took off her boots. Caden crouched down beside her. He placed his palm on the stone a meter from her feet. He closed his eyes. His ability worked through the rock, through the stone beneath her feet. He could sense what was happening inside her body. Not in detail, not like a doctor, but he could see the structure of her energy channels. And he saw. Her core wasn't defective. It was too pure. Perfectly pure, like a filter that doesn't let dirty water through. The synthetic ether from the academy was like sand in a spring for her. Her body rejected it, fought against it, hence the fever and convulsions. She needed pure ether, primordial, unadulterated, the very same that oozed from the capillaries in the cavern. Caden opened his eyes and told her she wasn't broken. Lena blinked. He repeated himself, said her core was fine, that it was better than fine, that the problem wasn't with her, but with the junk they'd been feeding her for 10 years. She stood barefoot on the cold stone and didn't move. Then she asked how he knew. He replied that he was a geologist, that he'd spent his whole life distinguishing clean rock from dirty rock, and that the difference between ore and a human wasn't as great as it seemed. Lena didn't cry. She clenched her teeth, turned away, and stood like that for a minute. Then she said that if he was lying, she would kill him. Caden replied that it wasn't in his interest to lie. He needed a mage, not a corpse. The next day he went down into the cavern and gathered the ether. Not much, a palmful of liquid light in a clay bowl. Carefully. The threads were thin and snapped at the slightest rough touch. He'd learned to handle them like surgical sutures, slowly, gently, with 3 fingers. He brought it to the surface. The bowl glowed blue so brightly that Hiram took a step back. Caden placed the bowl in front of Lena. She stared at it, holding her breath. Then she reached out. She touched the surface with her fingertips, and she sighed. The ether entered her like water into dry earth, without heat. No trembling, no pain. For the first time in 10 years, magic hadn't caused her suffering. Lena raised her hand. A tiny flame danced at her fingertips. Small, blue, pure. She stared at it, her lips quivering. Caden silently left the cave. He gave her a minute, or 10, as long as it took. Hiram stood outside and asked what had happened. Caden replied that they now had a mage. Hiram asked if she was a good mage. Caden replied that he didn't know, but that she had 10 years of rage inside her and now had a way to release it. So most likely she was very good. In the days that followed, Lena changed before their eyes. The protective anger hadn't gone anywhere, but something else had been added to it. Energy, purpose. She cast spells every morning, simple things, fire, light, air currents, but every spell came to her cleanly and easily, no backlash, no pain. On the third day, she set a rock on fire. Not on purpose, she just put too much power into the fireball, and it passed through the boulder as if it were butter. Hiram said maybe she should practice farther away from camp. Caden was thinking about something else. Lena was strong, very strong, and she was a mage.
And the wastes were full of things a pickaxe wouldn't protect you from. On the 45th day, Mira arrived, a healer, a quiet woman of 26 with eyes that had seen too many deaths for her age. She didn't come alone. With her were 4 children from a burned-down village, not her children, orphans she had picked up along the way. The oldest was 12, the youngest was 4. The youngest was coughing, deeply, with a wheeze, exhaustion. A disease that killed in this world just as surely as hunger did in his former one. The child was fading. Mira knew it. The way she held him showed she was counting the hours. Caden looked at the boy, 4 years old, pale, with blue lips, with eyes that were already beginning to glaze over. He went down into the cavern, gathered ether, a full bowl, brought it back up, gave it to Mira. She looked at the bowl, at the liquid blue light, then at Caden. She asked how much it cost. He replied that it cost nothing. She said that a liter of liquid ether was worth 1,000,000 gold pieces on the market, that for that kind of money you could buy a village. He replied that he didn't need a village. He needed this child to be breathing tomorrow morning. Mira took the bowl. Her hands didn't tremble. The hands of a healer who works on autopilot because if she starts thinking, she'll stop. She poured the ether into the boy through her palms, slowly, controlling every drop. 10 minutes later, his lips turned pink. An hour later, he was breathing steadily. 3 hours later, he was asleep. A normal, healthy child's sleep. Mira sat beside him and counted his pulse. A habit. She counted the pulse of every person near her, always. Caden approached her when it got dark. He asked what she needed. She replied that she needed a place where she could heal people. Not a tent, not a corner. A place, with a roof, with tools, with windows facing east because morning light is important for those recovering. She said that and fell silent, as if she were used to being told no after such requests. Caden nodded. He remembered the east-facing windows. He already had a place in mind, a rocky outcrop south of the camp. Good rock, a level platform. And he knew why she'd mentioned the morning light. Not for the patients, for her. In memory of someone who loved the morning. He didn't ask. He just remembered. By the end of the 45th day, the population of Grey Rock numbered 9 people. Caden, Hiram, Emma, Lena, Mira, 4 children. Resources: a mine with water and copper ore, a cavern with ether. Structures: a cave, a furnace, a wall, the start of a tunnel. Their reputation began to grow, not in the system's numbers, in words that spread from village to village along the border of the Wastelands. That a stranger lives in the Deadlands, that he has water, that he heals children and takes no money, that he is a miner, not a lord, that he does not chase away those who come. Rumors are like groundwater. They flow slowly, but one day they reach the surface, and then nothing can drive them back. Lena Hayes turned out not to be a defective mage, but the possessor of an ultra-pure core incompatible with synthetic ether. Caden extracted the first primordial ether from the cavern, and Lena cast a spell for the first time without pain. On the 45th day, the healer Mira arrived with 4 orphans. Caden gave a liter of ether worth 1,000,000 gold pieces to treat a dying child. Rumors about Grey Rock began to spread through the surrounding settlements. On the 47th day, Caden learned what betrayal was. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet as a crack in the rock that can't be seen until the vault collapses. Among the refugees who came to Grey Rock was a woman named Dale. She arrived on the 42nd day. She said she had worked as a maid in a minor baron's house, that the baron had gone bankrupt and fired the servants.
that she had nowhere else to go. A common story. Caden gave her a job: laundry, cooking, clearing stones from the site for the future hospital. Dale worked quietly and diligently. She smiled at the children. She helped Mira. She asked no questions. Hiram said he didn't like her, that she was too quiet, that people who work so quietly are either saints or spies, and saints don't come to the Wastelands. Caden heard it. He remembered it. But he didn't act on it, because there was no evidence, and he wasn't going to kick someone out on suspicion. The evidence appeared on the 47th day. Emma brought it. The girl who knew every nook and cranny in the Wastelands had spotted tracks, fresh ones, leading away from the camp to the east. The set of tracks, one belonged to Dale, heavy boots, a military stride. Emma followed them to a rocky ridge 6 kilometers away. There, on a rock, lay pigeon droppings and feathers. Carrier pigeons. Yahello was passing on information. Caden called a meeting. Meeting is a bit of an exaggeration. Hiram, Lena, Mira, Emma stood to the side but listened. Caden laid out the facts. Then he said there were 2 options: kick Yahello out and wait for the next spy, or keep her and monitor exactly what she sends. Lena wanted to kick her out, immediately. She basically wanted to set something on fire. Hiram suggested keeping her. He said it was better to know where the snake was than to guess where it would strike. Mira said nothing. Caden chose Hiram's option, but with an addition. He called Yahello over, looked her in the eyes, and said he knew. That he knew about the pigeons, about the tracks, about the man in heavy boots who'd walking her along the ridge. Yahello turned pale. Then she tried to run. Lena blocked the exit with a wall of fire. Not hot, just a warning. Yahello sat down on a rock and cried. She told them everything. The Valor House, the 4th largest corporation, specializing in intelligence and information. They hired her for 300 gold pieces and the promise of a roof over her head. She was supposed to report on the amount of ether, on the number of people, on Caden's skill, especially on his skill. The corporations already knew there was ether in Grey Rock. The system's global notification had taken care of that. But they didn't know how much, and they didn't know how a single man with a pickaxe had found what their scouts hadn't found in 1,000 years. Caden listened. Then he asked what she had already sent. Yahello listed it: the number of inhabitants, the presence of water, the presence of a mage, the location of the mine. She didn't know about the cavern. She didn't know about the river of ether 1,000 meters deep. She didn't know the scale of the deposit. Caden nodded. Bad, but not a disaster. Then he did something no one expected. He offered to let Yahello stay, not as a spy, as a resident, on the condition that she show him every subsequent message before sending it. Yahello looked at him as if he were crazy. Lena looked at him the same way. Hiram shook his head but said nothing. Caden explained. Corporations will keep sending spies over and over. They'll have to hunt down every new one. Each new one will be smarter than the last. It's better to have a channel you control. Through Yahello, he could send exactly the information he wanted Valor to receive, not the information that actually existed. Hiram smirked. He said that for a miner, Caden knew too much about snakes. Caden replied that there were snakes in the mines too, just stone ones. Yahello stayed. The first controlled message was sent the next day. In it, Caden reduced the ether reserves 20-fold and increased the number of armed men 5-fold. Let them think there's little to mine here and plenty of problems. On the 50th day, construction of the hospital began. Caden chose the spot he'd picked out for Mira, a rocky outcrop, south-facing, windows to the east, morning light. He wasn't building it alone. By this point, 23 people lived in Grey Rock. Refugees arrived every 2 or 3 days. Families, lonesomes, old people, children, all with the same story. Ether is gone. No work. Nothing to eat. They'd heard that in the Wastelands, they took everyone. Caden took everyone. He gave everyone a job on the very first day, not out of kindness, out of calculation. An idle man is dangerous. A man with a job builds. 10 people worked at the hospital, 5 on the mine expansion, 3 at the brick kiln. 2 women took charge of the kitchen. Hiram commanded the construction site with the air of a retired general who'd forgotten he'd retired. Lena trained, 4 hours every day. Her strength grew at an alarming rate. The primordial ether from the cavern was the ideal fuel for her. On the 55th day, she created a protective dome over the camp, not permanent, for 20 minutes, but dense. An arrow wouldn't have gotten through. Caden looked at it and said it was good. Lena replied that she could do better. He said he knew. On the 58th day, the first delegation arrived. A carriage, 4 horses, a coat of arms on the door. House Aurelius, the second corporation, specializing in ether trade. Their main business is reselling raw materials mined by others. The ambassador stepped out of the carriage in a silk cloak with rings on every finger. His name was Raynar Duval, 40 years old, a greasy smile, the eyes of an accountant behind the masked diplomat's mask. He had expected to see a fortress, or at least a castle. He saw a construction site, bricks, mud, people hauling stones, and a man on a crate eating porridge from an iron bowl who didn't stand up when the carriage stopped. Raynar approached and delivered a welcoming speech. A long one, with titles, with compliments, with hints of mutually beneficial cooperation. Caden listened to the end. Then he looked at the ambassador and said that his left kidney was hurting. Raynar fell silent. Caden explained. By the way the ambassador was standing, weight on his right leg, a slight tilt, protecting his left side. Classic signs. Then he added that if the ambassador had drunk water from the north well on his way here, that would explain the pain. There's copper in the groundwater there. A cumulative effect. In a year, it will be too late. Raynar turned pale. He had indeed drunk from the well by the northern road 2 days ago. Caden said he could tell him which well was safe, for free. Raynar forgot his speech, forgot the titles, forgot his rings. He stood there looking at the dirty man on the crate, trying to figure out how he'd found out. Caden didn't explain. He just pointed on a map drawn with a stick on the ground where the water was clean and where it wasn't. Raynar listened and memorized it. Then he got back to business. The House of Aurelius was offering an exclusive contract to purchase ether. Good terms, 30% of the market price. Caden asked why 30 and not 70. Raynar explained that Grey Rock was small, that they lacked infrastructure, that delivery through the wastes was expensive, that 30% was generous for a new supplier. Caden nodded. He said he'd think about it. Raynar left. Caden thought about it for exactly as long as it took for the carriage to disappear over the horizon. Then he told Hiram that 30% was an insult, that Aurelius wanted to buy up his ether for 1/3 of the price and resell it for full price, that they hadn't even tried to hide their greed. Hiram asked what he was going to do. Caden replied that he wouldn't sell to Aurelius, or to any of the 10 corporations for that matter, for now. Hiram asked, to whom then? Caden said there were small principalities in the north, the ones to whom the corporations sell ether at triple the price, the ones that spend half their budget just to light the lamps in the capital. He would sell to them, at a fair price. Hiram said that was war. Caden replied that it was business. The war will start later, the 60th day. The hospital is 2/3 complete. The walls are up. The roof is still temporary, made of stretched fabric. But there are already windows facing east. Mira moved the instruments and patients there. 3 children with ether depletion, an old man with a fracture, a woman after a difficult delivery. Mira worked around the clock. Caden brought ether from the cavern every 2 days, a cup, sometimes 2. Taking more is dangerous. The capillaries are thin, and if you tear them greedily, they dry up for weeks. He learned to extract it carefully, like a surgeon, like a jeweler, 1 drop at a time. Lena helped Mira, not as a healer, as a source of energy. She had learned to channel ether through herself and give it to the patient as warm light. Mira guided, Lena charged. Together, they pulled 5 children out of ether exhaustion in 3 weeks, every single one, without loss. On the 62nd day, Caden sent out the first trade caravan. 3 sacks of copper ore, 2 vessels of liquid ether. A small amount, symbolic, but enough for word to reach those who needed to hear it. Hiram led the caravan. With him were 2 former mercenaries who had arrived in Grey Rock on the 52nd day and whom Caden had entrusted with security after testing their skills. A mercenary's hands don't lie. Calluses from a sword on their right palms. Old ones. Real, not fake. The caravan was headed for the Principality of Thornwold in the northeast, a small mountain state, 3,000 inhabitants. The only supplier of ether so far had been House Caldwell. The price was 3 times the market rate. There was no choice. Now there was a choice. Hiram returned 8 days later with a full cart, grain, iron, cloth, tools, seeds, and a letter from the Prince of Thornwold. Short, 3 lines. Thanks. And a request for regular supplies. Caden read the letter and put it in his pocket. The first ally, small, poor, of no interest to anyone, but the first. From that day on, Grey Rock ceased to be a refugee camp in the Deadlands. It became a trading post, tiny for now, invisible for now, but alive. The 70th day.
Grey Rock had 48 inhabitants. Caden stopped counting after the 50th. Hiram didn't stop. The old man kept records in a notebook he'd traded for a piece of copper in Rainhold. Every person, name, where they came from, what they could do, how much they ate. Hiram counted mouths because someone had to. Caden counted the rock. The mine was expanding. The main shaft reached 100 meters. Side tunnels branched out on 3 levels. The aquifer ran like clockwork. The copper vein yielded a steady output. But the main action was happening below. Through a natural well that Emma had pointed out, Caden descended into the cavern every 2 days. He set up a rope ladder, primitive, dangerous, but functional. In the cavern, he collected ether from the capillaries and mapped the structure of the underground river. With each descent, he saw more. The river flowed from north to south, wide, powerful, and man-made. The walls of the riverbed were lined with a material he had never encountered before. Not stone, not metal, something in between, smooth, solid, with an internal structure resembling a crystal lattice. This material was 10,000 years old and had lost not a single % of its strength. Caden touched it through the rock and felt its age. He could feel the hands of those who had laid it, thousands of hands, maybe tens of thousands. A civilization that knew it was dying and, instead of fleeing or fighting, had built reservoirs for those who would come after. Every time Caden thought about it, his throat tightened. On the 75th day, Sora Choi arrived at Grey Rock. Korean, 19 years old, petite, loud, with a backpack from which a ladle stuck out. She was the chosen one of 10,000, a strayer just like Caden. She had died in a car accident in Seoul a week before her thesis defense in food chemistry. The system had granted her the skill perfect taste, the ability to break down any dish into its molecular components with a single bite. A useless skill for war, useless for hunting, useless for magic. She chose a spot on the southern coast, a beautiful place, warm with fish. She lasted there 3 weeks. Then the local Fishermen's Guild burned down her hut and told her the chosen weren't welcome here. She walked across half the continent for 2 months. She worked in kitchens, washed dishes, slept in ditches. Heard about Grey Rock from a merchant in Rainholt. Came here. Stood at the camp entrance and smiled that smile that hides exhaustion. Said she could cook, that it was the only thing she knew how to do, and that if there was a kitchen here, she'd be willing to work for food and a place to sleep. Caden sat on his crate. He looked at her, at the ladle in her backpack, at her hands marked with oil burns, at the way she stood, straight, despite everything. He said there was a kitchen but no cook, and that the title was Chef Choi, not cook, not kitchen hand. Chef. Sora blinked. Then she laughed, her first real laugh, without a shield, without a mask. Just the laugh of a girl who, for the first time, was called by her name and not by her role. She got the kitchen that very day. Pots and pans, supplies, and complete freedom of action. The next morning, the camp woke up to the smell. Sora found wild onions in the crevices.
She found the roots that Emma had shown her 10 minutes after they met because Emma knew every plant in the wastes. She found spices in the bag of a merchant who had brought grain from Thornwald, and she cooked soup. Caden tasted it and froze. It was the best soup he'd ever eaten, in both of his lives. Sora stood nearby, waiting for his reaction. Caden said she was fired as a cook. Sora turned pale. Caden added that she was promoted to head chef of Grey Rock with the right to purchase any ingredients at the Treasury's expense. Sora called him a jerk. Then she laughed. Then she fed the entire camp. On the 80th day, the first assassination attempt took place. Night. Caden was sleeping in the cave. Hiram was snoring in the corner. Lena was on watch at the entrance. She saw a shadow, movement by the hospital wall. A person, not from the camp, a stranger, moving like a hunter, quietly, quickly, toward Caden's cave. Lena didn't scream. She struck. A fiery lash, thin, precise. She aimed for the legs, missed by 3 centimeters. The man jumped back. A knife flashed in his hand. Long, thin, professional. A hired killer. Lena struck again. This time she hit her mark. The whip wrapped around his ankle. The smell of burnt skin. A scream. The man fell. Caden woke up to the scream. He ran outside. He saw Lena standing over the bound man with a burn on his leg and a knife 2 meters away. The man refused to speak. The knife turned out to be poisoned. Contact poison on the blade. 1 scratch and cardiac arrest in 3 minutes. Mira identified the poison by its smell. Shadow vine extract. Rare. Expensive. The kind professionals use. Caden sat in front of the bound killer and thought. Not about who sent him, that was obvious. One of the corporations, maybe Caldwell, maybe Valor, maybe someone new. He was thinking about something else. About the fact that the assassin had come for him. Not for the mine, not for the cavern. For him, personally. They were aiming for his head. Kill Caden and Grey Rock would crumble. Because everything rests on one man. Hiram had told him that in the first week. Caden hadn't listened. Now he was listening. He let the assassin go, untied him, returned the knife without poison, told him to go back to those who sent him, and passed on a message that Lord Grey Rock eats only what he cooks himself or what his head chef prepares, that he sleeps under the protection of a mage whose core is purer than anything the Academy has ever seen, and that next time they should send someone smarter. The assassin vanished into the night. Hiram asked why Caden had let him go. Caden replied that a dead assassin is a report the client won't receive. A living assassin is a message. And fear. Because the mercenary will return and report that he couldn't get past the mage in Grey Rock, which means the next attempt will be more costly. And time is costly. And time is exactly what he needs. Lena stood to the side. Her hands were shaking. Not from fatigue, from adrenaline. It was the first time she had struck a person with the intent to cause harm. Caden walked over to her. He said thank you, simply, without fanfare. Lena replied that he could at least lock the entrance at night. Caden replied that he would do so from now on. The next day he began building a wall around Grey Rock. Not before the hospital, as he had originally planned. After the hospital. But before everything else. Lena was right. Hiram was right. Emma, who had been sitting on the roof at night and saw the killer a minute before Lena did, was right too. One person can't carry everything on their shoulders, but they can build a wall behind which those shoulders will be safe. Everyone built the wall. 48 people. Stone from the quarry, bricks from the kiln, clay for the mortar. Caden calculated the outline. Not a square, not a circle. An irregular polygon tracing the contours of the rocky foundation. Every corner on solid bedrock, every section following the natural elevation changes. The wall used the terrain as part of its defense. Caden knew the terrain better than anyone. He could see right through it. The 90th day, 3 months. The wall is half finished, 2 meters high, 1 meter thick. Not a fortress, but a barrier. Inside the wall is a settlement. The hospital is finished. Sora's kitchen is up and running. The mine is operational. Water is flowing. The population is 61 people. The system interface has been updated. Grey Rock has been granted settlement status. Not a city, not a village. A settlement. An intermediate rank. Caden glanced at the status and closed the interface. He wasn't interested in the numbers. What interested him was that a dust cloud had been visible on the southwestern horizon for 3 days. A caravan, a large one, moving slowly.
Not a trade caravan, a military one. Banners of House Caldwell. The Caldwell caravan had stopped 20 kilometers from the Wasteland border. It hadn't crossed in. It had set up camp. 100 tents, 3 banners with a black griffin on a gold field. According to Emma, who had gone on a reconnaissance mission as if to a neighboring yard, there were about 500 soldiers there. Heavy infantry, siege shields, 2 catapults, and mages, at least 10. Emma counted by the number of glowing tents. Mages always burn ether for comfort, even in the field, a rich man's habit. Caden listened to the report. He wasn't scared, he wasn't pleased. He walked over to the wall and placed his palm on the stone. He scanned the ground in the direction of Caldwell's camp. 20 kilometers was far beyond his usual range, but he didn't need to see the camp. He needed to see the road. The wasteland between Grey Rock and the spot where Caldwell stood. Every crack, every layer, every weak spot. Caden watched for 3 hours. Blood flowed from his nose in a steady stream. Hiram stood nearby with a rag. When Caden opened his eyes, they were red. The small blood vessels had burst from the strain. He walked silently into the cave, sat down on a rock, took a stick, and began to draw on the floor. Hiram, Lena, Emma, Mira, Sora. Everyone stood around and watched as he drew lines on the stone floor. Caden was drawing a map, not of the surface, of the underground. The wasteland between Grey Rock and Caldwell's camp was crisscrossed with cracks like old glass. Millennia-old volcanic ash concealed a network of underground cavities, pockets of emptiness, thin vaults, areas where the strata held together by a thread. Any army marching straight through this risked falling through, but Caldwell wasn't a fool. He has scouts. They'll find a safe path, or clear a path with magic, or simply bypass the wastes from the east, where the ground is firmer. Caden studied his map and calculated. Not soldiers, not swords, not spells. Tons, pressure, points of force application. He calculated like an engineer. Then he looked up and said he needed 3 months. Lena asked what for. He replied that it was to win the war before it even began. Caldwell wouldn't attack right away. 500 soldiers in the wastes was expensive. Every day they camped there cost money. Water was hauled there by wagon trains. Food, too. Ether for mages, even more so. Marcus Caldwell won't waste resources on a siege of a settlement of 60 refugees. He's waiting for Grey Rock to grow large enough to be worth attacking, or waiting for an order from the Council of 10, or waiting for a pretext. In any case, he's waiting. But Caden isn't waiting. Caden is digging. The next 3 months became the hardest in the history of Grey Rock. Caden worked 16 hours a day, not in the mine, underground, in the wastes. He would set out at dawn with a pickaxe and a bag of food. He would walk to a point he had marked on an underground map. He would descend into a natural cavity, and he would strike. Not the rock, the strata, the natural strata holding up the seam. He would chip away at key points, centimeter by centimeter, millimeter by millimeter. The calculation was insanely complex. Every blow had to weaken the strata just enough so that it would hold under its own weight, but collapse under the weight of an army. 500 men in heavy armor, plus siege engines, plus supply wagons. Dozens of tons of pressure per square meter. Caden knew the exact figure. He had spent his life calculating loads on rock. In the old world, this saved miners from cave-ins. In this world, it created traps. He told no one but Hiram exactly what he was doing. The others knew only that the Lord went out into the wastes every day and returned in the evening, dirty and exhausted. Hiram knew, and he kept quiet, because he understood. Because for 30 years, he himself had listened to the rock groaning before a collapse. Lena trained,
Every day, Caden asked her for one specific thing, to learn how to create a directed shockwave. Not fire, not lightning, sound, a vibration, one that would pass through stone as easily as through water. Lena didn't ask why. She was smart. She understood. Emma became a scout, officially. Caden assigned her the task of monitoring Caldwell's camp. She would leave for 2 or 3 days. She'd return with reports, accurate, detailed. How many tents were there? How many soldiers went out for training? Where Caldwell's scouts went? She knew the Wastelands better than any map. To her, those gray plains were home. To Caldwell's soldiers, they were hostile territory. On the 110th day, what Caden had been waiting for happened. Reinforcements approached Caldwell's camp. Another 300 soldiers, light cavalry, 2 high-ranking battle mages, and Marcus Caldwell himself, the head of the house, in person. Emma brought a description. Tall, broad-shouldered, graying temples, a black cloak with a griffin. He walks unescorted among the tents, talks to the soldiers, eats from the communal pot. Not an aristocrat playing at war, a commander who knows what the battlefield is like. Caden listened and nodded. Marcus Caldwell had come in person. That meant the decision had been made. There would be an attack. The question was when. On the 120th day, Caldwell sent a messenger, an officer in a clean uniform carrying a white flag. He brought a letter. Beautiful handwriting on fine paper bearing the Griffin seal. Marcus Caldwell proposed a meeting, in person, unarmed, on neutral ground between the camps. Caden read the letter. He reread it. He looked at Hiram. Hiram said it was a trap. Caden replied that it was possible, but that Marcus Caldwell wasn't the type to kill during negotiations. It was bad form, even for corporations. Killing during negotiations destroys trust in all future negotiations. And Caldwell does business with more than just Grey Rock. Lena said she would go with him. Caden said no, that he would go alone. Lena said he was an idiot. Caden agreed, but he went alone. The meeting took place at dawn on the 121st day. A flat clearing in the middle of the wastes, ash and stone, nothing else. Caden arrived in a work shirt with a pickaxe slung over his shoulder. Marcus Caldwell arrived in a black doublet, unarmed. They stood facing each other. Marcus was a head taller, broader in the shoulders, with the face of a man who made decisions on which the lives of thousands depended and slept soundly afterward. He spoke first. He said he respected what Caden had done, that building a settlement from nothing in the Wastelands was an achievement, that the ether source was impressive, and that he was offering an alliance, a real one, not a contract like Aurelius's, a partnership. The Caldwell house would take Grey Rock under its protection, provide infrastructure, builders, mages, engineers, in exchange for 50% of the ether and the right to station a garrison. Caden listened. Then he asked about Caldwell's miners, about those mines that collapse every year, about those engineers whose safe mine designs were scrapped for profit. Marcus didn't flinch. He said that safety costs money, which isn't available in the midst of a war with the Devourers, that every gold spent on mine reinforcement is gold not spent on weapons, that he isn't a monster but a manager, and that management is about making choices. Caden replied that choosing to kill miners is not management but murder, just slow and dressed up in pretty reports. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he said that Caden didn't understand the scale of the problem, that without the corporations, humanity on Arion would die out within a generation, that the Devourers were consuming ether faster than it could be mined, that a firm hand was needed. Caden nodded. He said he understood the argument. He didn't agree, but he understood, and that he had a counterproposal. 0% of the ether, 0 garrisons, but he was willing to sell Caldwell data on the soil beneath his main mine, because in 20 years, a collapse would begin there, a major one. And if they don't reinforce it now, Caldwell will lose not just the miners, but the entire mine. Marcus looked at him for a long time. Then he asked how he knew. Caden replied that it was his job. Marcus shook his head. He said that Caden was making a mistake, that without an ally he wouldn't survive. Caden replied that he would survive, and that if Marcus wanted to test him, he should try crossing the Wastelands. Marcus looked him in the eyes. Caden didn't look away. They stood like that for about 10 seconds. Then Marcus turned and walked away. Caden stood on the ashes and watched him go. Then he placed his palm on the ground. Beneath his feet, the Wastelands waited, ready, charged. 3 months of work, 16 hours a day, thousands of picks to the right spots, a network of cracks turned into a controlled collapse system. All it takes to activate it is a single directed shockwave to one specific point. Lena knows how, Caden knows where. All that's left is to wait. The attack began on the 130th day, at dawn. Emma ran in an hour before, said the camp had broken up. They're coming, all of them. 800 soldiers, cavalry in front, infantry behind, catapults in the supply train, mages on the flanks, Marcus Caldwell in the center. They were taking the eastern route, the very one where the ground is firmer. Caldwell's scouts had found a safe path, or so they thought. Caden listened. He stood up, went out onto the wall, looked to the southwest. Dust on the horizon, far away, about 6 hours' march, maybe 5 if the cavalry picks up the pace. He went down, gathered his people, Hiram, Lena, Emma, Mira, Sora. 20 men from the village who knew how to hold something heavy in their hands. Caden looked at them and realized that an army made up of them would be as useless as a violin made from a pickaxe. Not warriors, refugees, miners, peasants, old men and teenagers, against 800 professional soldiers with mages. He told them they wouldn't have to fight, that he wouldn't lead them into battle, that their job was to stand on the wall and watch, just watch. They didn't understand. He didn't explain. He picked up his pickaxe, nodded to Lena, said, "Let's go." They left Grey Rock through the western gate. Caden walked in silence. Lena walked beside him. She didn't ask where. She knew. For 3 months, she had been training her directed shockwave. For 3 months, Caden had gone into the wastes with a pickaxe. She put 2 and 2 together. They walked for 2 hours. Caden led the way along a route he knew by heart. Every rock, every crack, every spot he had weakened over those months. He led her to a rocky ledge at the edge of the gorge. Gray Gorge. A wide passage between 2 ridges of rock. The only route through the eastern part of the wastelands for a heavy convoy. Caldwell's scouts had chosen it because the gorge's floor looked solid. Looked. Caden placed his palm on the rock. He scanned it. The army was 4 kilometers away. He could feel the vibration. Thousands of feet, hundreds of hooves, dozens of wheels. The pressure on the ground was growing by the minute. He turned to Lena, pointed to a spot. "That rock over there, gray with a white streak, see it?" Lena saw it. Caden told her that when he gave the signal, she had to strike that rock, not with fire, with sound. A directed vibration downward, through the rock into the bedrock. A single pulse, maximum power. Lena looked at the rock. She looked at Caden. She asked what would happen. Caden replied that there would be a collapse, a controlled one. The bottom of the gorge would sink 6 to 8 meters. The army would fall through. They wouldn't die. 6 meters isn't a fatal height for a person in armor, but the horses would break their legs. The catapults would collapse. The formation would fall apart. And you can't climb out quickly of a pit 2 human heights deep while wearing heavy armor. Lena looked at him and said nothing. Then she said he'd been planning this for 3 months. Caden nodded. She said he was crazy. He didn't argue. They waited. An hour. 2. Caden lay on the rock and listened to the ground. He could feel the army entering the gorge. The vanguard, the cavalry, the light infantry, then the main force. Heavy infantry in 3 ranks, shields, spears. Then the supply train. Catapults, wagons with provisions, then the rear guard, mages, the command, Caldwell. Caden waited until the entire column had entered, not part of it, all of it. 800 men across 2 kilometers of the gorge. The pressure on the rock reached its calculated maximum. He could feel the stone groaning beneath them, how the cracks he had been widening for 3 months were beginning to connect. Another minute and the collapse would begin on its own, without his command. No, control, precision, not a moment sooner or later. When the last soldier of the rear guard passed the mark Caden had carved into the rock a month ago, he turned to Lena. He said one word. Now. Lena struck. She put everything into it. 3 months of training, 10 years of fury. Pure primordial ether from the cavern. The sound wave passed through the white-veined stone as if through a membrane. Downward, into the rock, into the network of cracks that Caden had been weaving for 3 months. The earth trembled. Not violently, not like an earthquake. Like a sigh. A deep, heavy sigh from a planet that was tired of holding on. Then the bottom of the gorge sank. It didn't collapse. It didn't explode. It sank, evenly, along its entire length, like a floor slowly giving way. 6 meters, 8 in some places. Dust rose in a wall, screams, the neighing of, the crash of a tree breaking, the clang of iron. 800 soldiers of Arion's finest army found themselves in a ditch 2 stories deep. Alive. Almost all alive.
Caden had calculated it precisely. A subsidence, not a collapse. The rock had shifted downward, but hadn't shattered. It hadn't buried them. It had simply dropped. Like an elevator. A very fast and very rough elevator. Horses broke their legs. Catapults were reduced to splinters. Supply wagons overturned. The formation ceased to exist. 800 men in a pit in the desert, without water, without a supply train, without horses. Alive, but unable to fight. Caden stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down. The dust was settling. People were swarming below. Someone was shouting orders. Someone was moaning. Mages were trying to create stone supports to climb out. They were succeeding, slowly. In an hour or 2, they would start climbing out. By evening, everyone would be out. But the army would cease to be an army. Broken horses, shattered siege engines, lost supplies, soldiers in shock. Mages who had spent their ether on rescue instead of attack. Caden turned to Lena. She stood there, pale. Her hands were shaking. She was looking down at the 800 people she had just dropped into the pit. Caden said they were alive, all of them. She nodded. She said nothing. They returned to Grey Rock. The townspeople stood on the wall, watching the column of dust above the gorge. Hiram asked what it was. Caden replied that it was geography. Hiram snorted. Sora stood by the kitchen with a ladle in her hand and her mouth agape. Mira was checking a pulse, his own. Emma sat on the roof and smiled, for the first time without her hood. The next day, a lone rider came to the walls of Grey Rock, unarmed, without a banner, in a dusty black doublet. Marcus Caldwell. He dismounted, approached the gate, asked for an audience. Caden sat on his crate inside the wall, eating from an iron bowl, porridge that Sora had prepared that morning, with wild onions and a root that Emma had found yesterday. Marcus entered through the gate, hands behind his back, not bound, free, but empty. He stood before Caden and said nothing. Then he said he didn't understand how. Caden replied that it was geology. Marcus said that no mage on Arion was capable of collapsing a gorge. Caden replied that he wasn't a mage, he was a miner, and that the gorge had collapsed on its own. All it needed was a nudge. Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he asked how much Caden wanted. For the prisoners, for the horses, for this to end. Caden set down the bowl. He looked at Marcus and said nothing. That there were no prisoners because he hadn't taken anyone captive, that the soldiers could go home right now, that he wouldn't kill him because he needed Caldwell's miners alive. Then he took a folded sheet of paper out of his pocket, a map. He spread it out on the ground. He pointed to a spot. He said, "Right here, under your main mine, in 20 years, a collapse." He marked it. If Marcus wanted, he could send engineers. Caden would tell them how to reinforce it. Marcus looked at the map, then at Caden, then back at the map. Then he straightened up and bowed, deeply, slowly.
like a man bowing for the first time in his life to someone who has no title, no army, not even a whole shirt. Caden didn't get up from the crate. Caldwell's army of 800 soldiers entered the Grey Gorge, and Caden activated the controlled collapse system using Lena's directed shockwave. The bottom of the gorge sank 8 to 8 meters, immobilizing the army without a single casualty. Marcus Caldwell came to Caden personally and received a map warning of a collapse in his mines. Caldwell bowed and withdrew. The war was over. After Caldwell's departure, Grey Rock changed. Not physically, the settlement still stood on the ashes. The wall was still unfinished. Sora's kitchen still operated in a stone alcove under a cloth canopy. But something had shifted in the air, in the way people walked, in the way they looked at the horizon. Before, they looked with anxiety, now with something resembling pride. 61 people had stood their ground against 800. No one fought, no one fired a shot, no one died. But they held their ground. The news spread through Arion like wildfire. Not through newspapers, because there were no newspapers here. Through merchants, through refugees, through those very same Caldwell soldiers who returned home and told how the ground had given way beneath their feet. 2 weeks after the battle at Grey Rock, 40 people arrived in a single day. A month later, the population had surpassed 200. 2 months later, 400. Caden could no longer cope, not with the ether, not with the mine, with the people. 400 people isn't a camp, it's a city. A small, dirty, unfinished city, but a city nonetheless. And a city needs structure. It needs laws. It needs people to keep order. It needs a sewer system, for crying out loud. Hiram became the administrator, officially. Caden handed him the notebook where the old man had kept his records and said that from now on, he was responsible for everything on the surface. Every newcomer went through Hiram. Name, where from, what skills, where to house them, what job to give them. Hiram grumbled that he was a miner, not a mayor. Then he would sit down at his desk and work until midnight. Lena became head of defense, not by title. In fact, after the battle in the gorge, people with skills began coming to her. Former mercenaries, hunters, a couple of young, low-ranking mages who'd been expelled from the academy for various reasons. Lena put them through their paces from morning till night, harshly, mercilessly, like a person who remembers that night when the assassin with the poisoned knife was heading toward Caden's cave. That would never happen again. Mira got her hospital, finished, with a roof, with windows facing east, with instruments that Caden had ordered through merchants from Thornwald. She worked without days off. Ether depletion, fractures, infections, childbirth, burns. Every day someone came, and she treated everyone. Caden brought her ether every 2 days, like clockwork. On the 150th day, Evelyn Wright arrived in Grey Rock. She didn't come on foot like the others. She arrived in a cart packed with blueprints. Tall, red-haired, with hands stained with ink. 31 years old, former chief engineer of the Caldwell house. Caden knew about her, not from spies, from the map he had given to Marcus. On that map was a mark that Caden had made for one specific person. The crack in the rock beneath the Caldwell mine ran along the same seam that Evelyn had described in her rejected safe mine project. Caden had found this project on the black market through dealers in Reinhold. He bought for 200 gold pieces. He read it and realized that the author of this project saw the rock almost the same way he did. Not through skill, through intellect, through calculations, through engineering intuition. Evelyn left Caldwell after the battle in the gorge, not because of the defeat, because of what happened afterward. Marcus returned and ordered the mine reinforced according to Caden's map.
But he did it the old way. Minimal support, maximum output, fast and cheap. Evelyn said that wasn't right, that they had to do it the right way. Marcus said there was no budget for the right way. She gathered the blueprints and left. For the second time in her life. The first time she left in silence. The second time she knew where to go. Caden met her at the gate. He pulled a rolled-up blueprint out of his pocket. That very one. The rejected safe mine project. He unfolded it, placed it on the cart.
and said he wanted to build it. For real. And that he needed her help. He needed to know where he was going wrong in his calculations. Evelyn looked at her drawing, at the signature in the corner, at the calculations she'd made 5 years ago and that Caldwell had tossed in a drawer. She took the blueprint, unfolded it completely, ran her finger along the lines. Then she looked at Caden and said he was wrong in 3 places, and that she'd show him where. Caden smirked, his first smile in a week. Evelyn was appointed chief engineer of Grey Rock. On her very first day, she walked through the mine and came out with the look of someone who had witnessed a nightmare.
She said the support on the lower levels was installed haphazardly, that the angle of the third drift was dangerous, that the ventilation was non-existent, and that if Caden didn't want his mine to become a mass grave, he had to halt mining for a week and let her redo everything. Caden halted mining that very hour. Evelyn worked for 7 days without a break. She rebuilt the support, she changed the angles of the drifts, she designed a ventilation system out of stone channels that carried the stale air to the surface through natural fissures. Caden showed her where the fissures were. She calculated the cross-sections of the channels. They worked together like 2 tools of a single master. He saw the rock, she knew what to do with it. By the end of the week, the mine was a different place. The air inside was fresh, the walls stood firm, the drifts ran at right angles, and at the entrance, Evelyn hung a sign she had carved herself from a piece of copper. 0 safe days, because the countdown begins from the moment of the last inspection. Caden looked at the sign and said that was right.
Evelyn replied that it would be right when the number on it exceeded 365. Caden nodded. On the 171st day, Grey Rock submitted an application to the system for city status. The system required 500 residents. There were 492. Caden didn't wait for the 8. He knew that a family of 11 was on the road from Reinhold. Emma had seen them that morning. 2 days later they arrived. 503. The system updated the status. Grey Rock, City. On the 180th day, the Council of 10 Corporations officially recognized Grey Rock as an ether supplier. Not because they wanted to, because 6 small principalities in the north were already buying from Caden, and giving up those principalities as trading partners became more costly than recognizing a new player. Grey Rock received the status of Corporation Number 11. Caden refused to accept the title of Duke. Hiram handed him the notification. Caden read it, crumpled it up, threw it in the furnace. He said he was a miner, that being a miner was a profession, not a title.
Hiram said that miners don't usually bring down canyons on the heads of armies. Caden replied that they do. It's just that usually it's called an accident. In the evening, he stood on the wall and looked west. The wastelands stretched out as a gray plain to the horizon, but not entirely gray, not anymore. At the foot of the wall, on a strip of land that Caden had been watering with water from the mine for 3 months, grass was pushing through. Green, scrawny, pitiful, but green. The first grass on the surface of the wastes in 1,000 years. Emma stood beside him, without her hood. The wind ruffled her dirty hair. She looked at the grass and couldn't tear herself away. Caden told her quietly that the wastelands weren't cursed, that they'd simply been waiting for someone who would look. Emma didn't answer, but for the first time in all the time he'd known her, she wasn't slouching. She stood straight, like a person with solid ground beneath their feet. Where somewhere below, 1,000 meters deep, the river of ether pulsed with an even blue light. Caden felt it as one feels a second heart, and he knew this was only the beginning. That beneath the ocean to the south, a second reservoir lay dormant. That there were 7 of them in all. That someone had laid them 10,000 years ago, and that this someone was waiting for him. After the victory over Caldwell, Grey Rock grew rapidly. Hiram became the manager. Evelyn Wright came from the House of Caldwell and completely rebuilt the mine. The population reached 500, and Grey Rock received city status. The Council of 10 recognized it as Corporation Number 11. Caden renounced the title of Duke. The first grass grew on the surface of the wastelands. On the 200th day,
Caden descended to the river for the first time. Not to the capillaries in the cavern, to the river itself. 1,100 meters. Evelyn designed the descent. A spiral tunnel inside the cavern with rest platforms every 100 meters. Reinforcement made of a new alloy that Lena had learned to create, copper and ether, stronger than steel, lighter than wood. It took 6 weeks to build, 40 miners working in shifts, not a single cave-in, not a single injury. Evelyn stood over every meter of the tunnel like a surgeon over an operating table. Caden went first, alone.
That's what he decided. Lena wanted to go with him. Hiram wanted to go. Evelyn insisted on going because it was her design, and if it collapsed, she had to be inside, not outside. Caden said no to all 3 of them. Whatever was down there, he must see alone. He descended for 4 hours. The spiral wound smoothly downward. The air changed every 100 meters. At first dry and dusty, then humid, then warm. At 500 meters, the cavern opened around him like a black dome, and he saw what he had previously seen only through experience. The capillaries of the ether in the walls glowed blue, like the veins of a living creature, like a map of the starry sky on the ceiling of a temple. Beautiful. So beautiful that he stopped and stood for a minute just looking. Then he continued his descent. Below the cavern, the tunnel led into monolithic rock, dense, ancient. 10,000 years ago, someone had cut this path downward, or burned it through. The walls were melted, smooth as glass. At 700 meters, Caden found the first inscription. Symbols burned into the melted stone. Not a language he knew, not runes, not hieroglyphs. Something else. Geometric shapes with an internal logic he sensed but could not read. He pressed his palm against the wall. His skill estimated the age. 10,000 years, give or take 20. The inscription was made in the year of the Great Drought, or a few years before. He memorized the symbols and moved on. At 900 meters, it got hot. The rock radiated heat, not from magma, from the ether. The river was close. At 1,000 meters, the tunnel widened, the ceiling rose, the floor became level, as if it had been smoothed out on purpose, as if there had been a room here. At 1,100 meters, Caden emerged at the river. He stopped, held his breath, then breathed again because his body left him no choice. The river lay before him, 10 meters wide, depth unknown. His ability couldn't penetrate the surface of the ether. Liquid light flowed slowly like honey, blue with golden veins, warm, alive, pulsating. The air above the river shimmered and sparkled. Caden felt with every cell in his body how the energy entered through his skin, through his lungs, through his eyes. His skill worked differently here, not for a mile, for 10, 20. He saw the entire structure of the underground network. A river that ran from north to south across the entire continent, branches to the east and west. And far away, very far away, at the edge of perception, other rivers, 6 of them, converging at 6 points. 6 reservoirs, just like under Grey Rock, scattered all over Arion. 1 under the ocean in the south, 1 in the mountains in the east, 1 under the ice in the north, 3 on other continents. 7 reservoirs, 7 rivers, 1 system. Caden stood on the shore and felt the scale of it. This isn't a deposit, it's infrastructure. Someone built a planetary system for storing and distributing ether, 10,000 years before the first corporation began mining ore. Then he sensed something else, far to the south, beneath the ocean, in the second reservoir. Something alive, not ether, not rock, not water. Something that had a shape, something that had boundaries, something that was sleeping. Caden clenched his fists. Blood flowed from his nose, from his eyes. He had crossed the line of what was permissible. The skill burned in his skull like a red-hot nail. He released his concentration. Let go.
He sat down on a rock by the riverbank and simply sat there for 10 minutes, wiping the blood from his face. Then he took a clay vessel out of his bag. He scooped ether from the river, a liter. The vessel glowed so brightly that Caden squinted. This was not capillary ether, not seeping through stone. Pure, primordial, from the source. He closed the vessel with its lid, put it back in the bag, and began the climb. 4 hours down, 5 up. When he climbed out of the shaft, it was dark. Hiram was sitting at the entrance, smoking his stinky moss. Lena stood nearby with her arms crossed. Mira, Sora, Evelyn, Emma on the roof. Everyone was waiting. Caden set the bag on the ground. He took out the vessel. He opened the lid. A blue light flooded the courtyard. Shadows ran across the walls. Faces were lit from below. No one spoke. Hiram dropped his pipe. Caden said that this was just one river, that there were 7 of them, that beneath this planet lay enough ether to last 1,000 years, that this wasn't nature, that someone had built it, and that this someone might still be alive. The silence lasted a minute. Then Sora said that dinner had gone cold,
and that if Caden didn't eat right now, she would personally shove him back into the mine. Caden laughed. He sat down on a crate. He ate the cold porridge with wild onions. The vessel with the ether stood on the rock and glowed. Moths gathered around it. The first moths in the Wastelands, drawn by the light from beneath the earth. Mira watched them and counted quietly. 7. 7 moths around a single light source. She didn't say it out loud, but Caden saw her counting. 7, like the number of reservoirs. On the 220th day, Caden called a council. A real one, not 5 people in a cave. 20. Hiram, Lena, Mira, Sora, Evelyn, Emma, plus the senior miners, plus the merchants from Rainhold who had moved to Grey Rock, plus the commanders of the security detachments, plus the Prince of Thornwold had sent his representative. They held the meeting in the new building that Evelyn had built in 3 weeks. Stone, spacious, with a long table made of copper plates. Caden sat at the head, on a crate, the very same crate. He'd screwed legs onto it so he wouldn't look shorter than the others, but the crate remained. A principle. He outlined what he'd learned down below. 7 reservoirs, a planetary network, man-made infrastructure, something alive beneath the ocean. The room was silent. Then the questions began. Evelyn asked about the construction, what the channel walls were made of, what material could last 10,000 years without degrading. Caden described it, a crystalline lattice, not stone, not metal. Evelyn took notes. Lena asked about the living thing, what exactly it sensed. Caden replied that it sensed form, boundaries, rhythm, like the breath of a sleeper. She asked if it was dangerous. He replied that he didn't know. Hiram asked the main question, what were they going to do with it? Caden replied that he had a plan. He broke it down into 3 parts. First, Grey Rock begins full-scale extraction of ether from the river, not from the capillaries, from the source. The volume will increase 100-fold. The price on the world market will plummet. Corporations will lose their leverage. People who currently pay more for ether than for food will be able to breathe. Second, he will personally head south to the ocean, to the 2nd reservoir. We need to understand what lies dormant there, and third, find someone who can read the inscriptions on the tunnel walls, because the builders left instructions, and he wants to read them. The council discussed the plan for 4 hours. By the end, they had agreed. Hiram stays to run Grey Rock. Evelyn is designing a system to extract resources from the river. Mira is expanding the hospital. Sora is in charge of supplies. Lena and Emma are going south with Cade and Lena for protection. Emma, because she's the only person who can lead the group through unfamiliar territory faster than a map. She doesn't have scouting skills. She has something better. Instinct. Before leaving, Caden spent 2 days with each of his men. Not all together, one at a time. He sat with Hiram by Joss's grave, in silence, for an hour. Then Hiram said that if Caden didn't return,
He would lead Grey Rock just as Caden himself would have, and that he didn't like it because Caden was crazy, and running things like a crazy person meant not sleeping. Caden replied that he would return. Hiram said that's what everyone says. He trained with Lena. She hit targets with fireballs while he timed her reaction.
4 seconds from command to strike. Fast, but not instantaneous. He told her that on the road, 4 seconds is a luxury, that she needed to learn to hit in 1. Lena replied that she would learn, and that if he stood closer, she wouldn't even need a second. He spent the night with Evelyn poring over blueprints. Not a romantic night, a working one. They were calculating a system for safely extracting ether from the river. Evelyn was designing the pumps. Caden showed her where to place the intake points so as not to damage the riverbed. They argued about the pipe diameter. He said 20 centimeters, she said 30. She was right. He admitted it and said she was always right about diameters. She said she'd remember that. He talked to Mira about the hospital. She said she needed a second floor. There were too many patients. 1 healer for 500 people isn't medicine, it's suicide. Caden asked what else was needed. Mira gave him a list. It was long. Instruments, medicines, 2 more healers, beds, fabric for bandages, glass for the windows, real glass, not fabric. Caden read the list. He nodded. He said that when he returned, she would get everything. Mira looked at him and quietly said that he couldn't promise something he didn't know, that he was leaving into the unknown, that he might not return. Caden replied that he might, and that was exactly why she would get everything, because if he wasn't there, then Grey Rock would have to manage without him, and the hospital is the backbone of the city. He ate with Sora. She'd packed him a travel kit, spiced jerky, compressed grain bars, salt mixed with herbs Emma had found in the crevices. Sora talked nonstop, about recipes, about how a merchant from Thornwald had brought pepper and that pepper was worth its weight in gold here, about how she wanted to build a real restaurant, not just a kitchen under a canopy. Then she fell silent. She looked at Caden and said that if he died, she would personally go down into the mine after him and pull him out, just like he'd pulled Joss out. Caden replied that he believed her. He didn't speak to Emma. They sat on the wall and watched the sunset, the first sunset without a veil of ash. The sky was pink and gold. The ventilation system of the ancient reservoirs, which Caden had opened 3 weeks ago, had begun to purify the air. The ash was settling. The sky was brightening. Emma was looking at the sun, for the first time without her hood, for the first time with her back straight, for the first time with an expression on her face that could be called peace. Caden said he would take her with him. She nodded, as if she knew. On the 230th day, a small caravan of 3 people left the southern gates of Grey Rock. Caden with a pickaxe on his back, Lena with a staff in which a crystal of primordial ether burned. Emma carried a backpack stuffed with maps she had been drawing her whole life. Hiram stood at the gate. Mira stood at the hospital window. Sora stood by the kitchen with a ladle in her hand. Evelyn stood on the roof of the mine shaft with a blueprint in her hand. 500 people stood on the wall and watched as the 3 walked off into the gray plain. Caden didn't turn around, not because he didn't want to, because if he turned around, he wouldn't leave, and he had to go. Far to the south, beneath his feet, something was sleeping, and it was beginning to wake up. The journey south took 40 days, through the wastelands, through the borderlands, through the territories of the 3 principalities that Caden supplied with ether and which let him pass without question. Through forests he hadn't seen once since arriving on Arian. Real forests, with trees, with birds, with the smell of earth that had nothing to do with ash. Emma saw a tree for the first time on the 4th day of the journey. She stopped. She walked over. She touched the bark. She stood there for 5 minutes. Lena stood beside her and said nothing. Caden waited. He didn't rush her. A person who had lived in the wastelands for 17 years had the right to touch a tree for 5 minutes. On the 20th day, they reached the coast, the southern sea, warm, blue, with white sand and waves that smelled of salt and something sweet. The same scent that Caden had sensed in the cavern, ether. The sea above the reservoir was saturated with it.
subtle, barely perceptible, but to Caden's sense, it was like the smell of smoke to a firefighter. He crouched on the shore, placed his palms on the sand, closed his eyes. His sense went down, through the sand, through the clay, through the coral limestone, through layers of sedimentary rock, deeper, deeper.
300 meters, 500, 700.
The ocean floor, a basalt slab, and beneath it, at a depth of 900 meters below sea level, a second reservoir, smaller than the one beneath Grey Rock, but denser. The ether here was concentrated in a narrow space, like a coiled spring, and at the center of this spring lay it. Caden saw it clearly, a form, humanoid, 2 meters, maybe a little more, curled up like a sleeping child, covered in something resembling a cocoon, a crystalline cocoon of solidified ether. It was breathing, slowly, 1 breath per minute. Caden counted, and with every breath, the ether in the tank pulsed. He opened his eyes. Blood was flowing from his nose and his right ear. Overkill. He lay down on the sand and spent 10 minutes lying there, staring at the sky. Lena sat beside him. Silently, she wiped the blood from his face with a rag. She didn't ask. She waited. When he was able to speak, he described what he had seen. A humanoid, a cocoon, asleep, breathing. 900 meters underwater. Lena asked how to get to it. Caden replied that there was no need to get there. We need to wake it up. From there, from the surface.
Lena asked how to wake someone who's been sleeping for 10,000 years. Caden replied that we had to knock. For the next 3 days, he prepared. He walked along the shore, scanning the seabed, looking for the right spot. The place where the rock above the reservoir is thinnest, where vibrations from the surface would reach the cocoon with minimal loss. He found it. A rocky cape 2 kilometers from their camp, a coral reef underwater, and beneath the reef a crack in the basalt, a natural channel like a kilometer-long speaking tube. Caden stood on the cape. He placed his palms on the rock and sent down the only thing he could send through the rock. A vibration, not a sound, an ethereal one. The skill worked both ways. He could not only read the rock, he could speak to it, weakly, at arm's length. But here, above the reservoir, where the ether permeated every layer of rock, his voice was amplified 100-fold. He tapped, 3 taps, through the stone, through the water, through 900 meters of silence. And he waited, 1 minute, 2, 5, 10. Nothing. Lena stood behind him with her staff ablaze. Emma sat on a rock and gazed out at the sea. Caden tapped again. 3 taps. Harder, deeper. Blood trickled from his nose. He didn't stop. 1 minute, 2. On the 3rd minute, the ground trembled, faintly, like a sigh. Caden felt it before Lena and Emma did. Below, the cocoon stirred. The creature inside shifted position, turned, and Caden felt the response. Not a sound, not words, an impulse. Through the rock, through the ether, through his skill, straight into his head. An image, not a picture, a sensation, like the Earth's tactile memory, only reversed. Someone had transmitted a sensation to him. Exhaustion, enormous, ancient, heavy as a kilometer-thick layer of rock. And a question, not in words, a sensation. Who are you? Caden answered, the same way, through his palms, through the stone, through the skill. He sent down everything he could. An image of Grey Rock, an image of the mine, an image of the cavern, an image of the river, the image of inscriptions on the walls, and a single, simple impulse. I found you. Why did you call me? Silence. Long. 1 minute. Another. Then the answer. Again, not in words. A series of images, rapid, painful. Caden shut his eyes against the flood. He saw. Arion 10,000 years ago. Green. Alive. covered with cities that glowed with ether like garlands. Then he saw a shadow. Something had come from outside. Not the devourers, something greater. Something that fed not on ether, but on the very source of ether, the root of the universe. He saw thousands of people working day and night, digging channels, laying reservoirs, 7 of them, all over the world, hiding the ether underground, underwater, under the ice, far away from what had come. I saw the last builder lie down in a cocoon, voluntarily, to preserve the system, to wait 10,000 years, until the one who could see it arrived, not through magic, with their own eyes. The last image, a face, human, tired, ancient, with eyes the color of ether, and a single sensation, not a word, a feeling, relief. You've come. Caden took his hands off the stone, fell to his knees. Lena caught him. He was pale, drenched in sweat, with blood on his face. But he was smiling, quietly, like a man who had found the answer to a question he had lived with his whole life. He told Lena that the one who had laid the reservoirs was still alive, that he had been waiting for Caden, personally, that the collapse in the Arizona mine that had killed him was no accident. He had been called, because they needed someone who could see the earth not with magic, but with their hands and eyes. Lena asked why. Caden replied that the Great Drought was not a catastrophe, it was a decision. Arian had hidden his ether to save him from something that came 10,000 years ago, and that something hadn't gone away. It was still here. The devourers that poured through the veil's rift weren't a new threat. They were an old one that had returned. Emma sat on a rock and said nothing. Then she quietly asked if it could be stopped. Caden looked at her, at the girl from the wastes who, for 17 years, had believed her land was cursed. He said it could be, that to do so they would need to find all 7 reservoirs, awaken the system the builders had laid down, and return the ether to the surface. All of it. Not drop by drop, not through the mines. All of it, just as it was 10,000 years ago. Lena asked what would happen to the corporations. Caden replied that they would become unnecessary, that if the ether flowed freely like water in a river, it would be impossible to sell it. Lena smiled wryly and said that was exactly why they would try to kill him long before he reached the 3rd reservoir. Caden nodded. He said he knew, and that was exactly why he had to hurry. The return trip took 30 days, faster than the way there. Emma found a shortcut through a mountain pass that wasn't on the maps. She always found shortcuts. On the 15th day of their journey, they met Jae-yoon Park. It was no coincidence. Jae-yoon was waiting for them. She stood on the pass with a sword on her back, 24 years old, a Korean-style face, short hair, eyes that assessed the distance to the target before they even saw the target itself. The daughter of the head of a mountain clan from the northern border. Her father had sent her to assess the threat from Lord Greyrock. She'd been following them from the coast, 2 weeks. Neither Caden nor Lena nor Emma had noticed her. She decided to come out on her own. She said she'd seen enough, that Lord Greyrock was not a threat, that he was something else. She didn't say what. Caden asked what she wanted. Jae-yoon was silent for a long time. Then she said her clan was dying out. Their sacred mountain was depleted. The ether within it had dried up. The shamans say the mountain is dead. The elders forbid trading with outsiders. Pride, honor, tradition. But the children cough at night, and the old people fall asleep and don't wake up. Caden listened. Then he said he wanted to see her mountain. Jae-yoon looked at him, appraisingly, like a warrior deciding whether to let a stranger past the wall or not. Then she nodded. The detour north added 10 days. The Pack clan's mountain was called Silver Peak. Beautiful, tall, covered with pine trees halfway up the slope and snow above. The village at the foot looked like a picture from an old book. Wooden houses, carved posts, prayer ribbons fluttering in the wind. And silence.
an ominous silence. The silence of a place where people conserve their energy for conversation. Father Jae-yin met them at the village gate, an old warrior with white temples and a back as straight as a spear. He looked at Caden as if he were an insect. Caden wasn't offended. He had seen eyes like that before.
The eyes of a man who had lost everything but his pride and now clung to it as if it were the last wedge in the rock. Caden asked permission to explore the mountain. The old man refused. Jae-yoon spoke to her father, quickly, quietly, in a language Caden didn't know. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. Then the old man looked at Caden again, differently now, not like an insect, like a tool that might be useful. He nodded. Caden climbed the mountain, alone. Jae-yoon wanted to go with him. He said he needed silence. He climbed for 3 hours. He found a spot on the western slope where the rock was exposed. He sat down. He placed his palms on the rock, and he saw. The shamans were wrong. The vein beneath the mountain hadn't dried up. It had shifted, a tectonic shift, slow, over hundreds of years. The vein had moved 200 meters to the west, out from under the mountain to the side. The shamans were searching where it had been before. Caden saw where it was now, powerful, alive, untouched. 200 meters to the west and 30 meters down. 2 days' work for a crew of 10 miners. He went down, told the old man. The old man listened with a stony face. Then he asked what Caden wanted in return. Caden replied that he wanted nothing, that he wasn't giving the Ether clan a gift. He was giving them their mountain back. It had always been theirs. It had just moved a little to the left. The old man looked at him for a long time. Then he turned to Jae-yoon. He said one sentence to her in their language. Jae-yoon straightened up. Her face didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. Later, as they were leaving the village, Caden asked what her father had said. Jae-yoon walked beside him. She was silent. Then she answered. He said, "Go with him." She added nothing. There was no need. From that moment on, Jae-yoon walked with them, in silence, with a sword on her back, like a shadow that carries a blade. On the 271st day, they returned to Grey Rock. The city had changed. Caden stood at the gate and didn't recognize it. The wall was finished, 3 meters high, with towers at the corners. Inside, streets, real ones, paved with stone from the mine. Houses, not caves, houses, with roofs, with windows. The miras had grown to 2 stories. Next to it stood a building Caden didn't recognize, a school. Mira had opened a school for the children, on her own, without asking. Because 20 children in a town and not a single teacher, that's not a town, it's a camp. Sora's kitchen had turned into a restaurant, a stone building, long tables, smoke from the chimney, a smell that made Caden's stomach churn after 40 days of road food. The mine was operating. Evelyn had launched the extraction system from the river, pumps based on her design, pipes made of ethereal copper, 20 liters of primordial ether per day. 20 liters. 20 million gold pieces at market price, every day. A population of 1,200 people. Hiram met him at the gate with a notebook. He said that 8 principalities now buy ether from Grey Rock, that House Aurelis had sent a new ambassador with an offer for a contract at 50% of market price. Caden asked about the previous ambassador. Hiram said that Raynar Duval had cured Mira's kidney and now lived in the city. He worked as an accountant. Caden blinked. Then he laughed. That evening he convened a council, an expanded one, 30 people, plus Jae-yoon, who stood by the wall and listened in silence. Caden told them everything. About the sleeper, about the ancient threat, about the 7 reservoirs, about how the Devourer's return was no accident, about how the Great Drought was a shield, not a catastrophe, and about how that shield must be removed. The room fell silent. Then Evelyn asked how to activate the reservoirs. Caden replied that he didn't know, for now, that the inscriptions on the tunnel walls were the key. Lena said she'd found someone. While Caden was in the south, she'd been looking for someone who could read the ancient symbols. She found him,
An old professor from the Academy of Magic, retired, half-mad, a specialist in dead languages. Expelled for a theory that the Great Drought was man-made. They sent for him a week ago. He's on his way. Caden nodded. He looked at his people. Hiram with a notebook, Lena with a staff, Mira with a list of the sick, Sora with a ladle, Evelyn with a blueprint, Emma without her hood, Jaeyoon with a sword. 1,200 people behind the wall. A city in the wastes that were beginning to turn green. He said they would start tomorrow. No one asked what exactly. Everyone knew.
On the way back, Caden met Jaeyoon Park and found a shifted ether vein beneath her sacred mountain. Jaeyoon joined him at her father's behest. During Caden's absence, Grey Rock had grown to 1,200 residents and begun industrial ether extraction. Caden told the council the truth about the ancient threat and the 7 reservoirs. Lena found an expert in ancient languages to decipher the inscriptions. The professor arrived on the 280 day. An old man of about 70, skinny as a rake, with a beard down to his waist and eyes that burned with that special fire found in people who have lived their lives for a single idea that no one else believed in. His name was Theodore Grant. For 40 years, he had argued that the Great Drought was not a catastrophe, but a choice. He had been expelled from the academy, stripped of his title. They took his library. He lived in a shack on the outskirts of the port city and wrote a book that no one read. When Lena's people found him and told him that Lord Greyrock wanted to show him 10,000-year-old inscriptions, Theodore didn't ask a single question. He gathered 3 bags of tools and books and followed them out. Caden personally lowered him into the tunnel, 700 meters deep, to the wall with the inscriptions. Theodore stood before the symbols and didn't move for 20 minutes. Then he sat down on the floor. He opened a bag. He took out a notebook, and he began to work. He worked for 3 weeks without coming to the surface. Caden brought him food. Sora cooked it specially. Theodore didn't notice what he was eating. He noticed only the symbols. On the 22nd day, he called for Caden. He said he had read it. Not all of it, a third, but enough. The inscriptions were instructions on how to activate the system. 7 reservoirs must be opened simultaneously, not one at a time, simultaneously. Each reservoir has a key point, a place where a signal can be sent to activate it. This requires a person who can see the rock's structure and send an impulse through the stone. Caden. Only Caden. But Caden alone isn't enough. He can't be in 7 places at once. Theodore read on. The builders had anticipated this. The system had a cascade activation mechanism. Activate the first reservoir, and it will send a signal to the second to the third, and so on. 7 reservoirs in 7 minutes. But for that to work, all 7 channels between them had to be clear, not clogged, not damaged. Over 10,000 years, the channels could have deteriorated. Caden checked. He went down to the river, lay down on the bank, palms on the stone, and scanned the entire network. It took a long time. It was agonizing. Blood from his nose, eyes, and ears. Hiram held him by the shoulders so he wouldn't fall into the river. 4 channels were clear. 3 were damaged. Blockages, collapses, tectonic shifts over millennia. To clear them, he'd have to physically reach each one. 3 expeditions, 3 reservoirs, under the ocean, in the mountains, under the ice. Caden told the council. The council listened. Then Hiram stood up and said it was madness. That Caden couldn't leave Grey Rock for months, that the corporations are waiting for exactly that without him, the city is vulnerable. Caden replied that Grey Rock is no longer him, that Hiram runs it better than he ever could, that Evelyn knows the mine better than he does, that Lena defends it better than any wall, that Mira heals, Sora feeds, Emma sees, Jaeyoon stands guard, that he didn't build this for himself, for them, and now it stands without him. Hiram was silent. Then he sat down. Then he said quietly that Caden really was crazy. 3 expeditions took 4 months. Caden didn't go alone. He went to the mountains in the east with Jaeyoon. She knew the mountains. She was born there. She crossed passes that no one else had crossed. She led him to the 3rd reservoir.
Caden climbed down. He found the blockage, a rockfall that had clogged the channel. 2 days of work with a pickaxe, millimeter by millimeter, centimeter by centimeter, blow after blow to the right spot. On the 3rd day, the channel opened. Ether gushed out like blood through a cleared artery. He went to the ice fields in the north with Lena. The cold was so intense that the pickaxe froze to his palms. Lena warmed the air around them with a continuous incantation. 3 days. The 4th reservoir. The channel was damaged by a tectonic shift, a 2-meter-wide fault. Caden couldn't seal it, but he could reroute it. He found a parallel crack in the rock, a natural bypass. He widened it with a pickaxe. He broke through the bridge. The ether found a new path, like water. It always does. He returned to the ocean reservoir with Emma. The girl from the Wastelands had seen the sea for the first time 3 months ago. Now she stood on the shore as if she were at home. The blockage was underwater. Caden couldn't dive 200 meters, but he could send a pulse through the rock, a directed vibration, like a landslide in a gorge, only finer, more precise. He pounded the rock for 3 hours, in measured doses, drop by drop, until the blockage crumbled from the resonance. When the last channel opened, Caden felt it with his whole body. The system shuddered. 7 reservoirs, 7 rivers, all connected, all ready. The sleeper beneath the ocean stirred in its cocoon. Image was sent, brief, a single sensation, ready. On the 360th day, the anniversary, Caden stood at the riverbank at a depth of 1,100 meters beneath gray rock. His people stood around him. Hiram, Lena, Mira, Sora, Evelyn, Emma, Jaeyoon, Theodore. They had all come down because they had to see. The river flowed before them, blue and gold, alive, pulsing. Caden knelt at the water's edge. He placed his palms on the stone. He closed his eyes, and he sent a signal, a single pulse, through the stone, across the entire planet, through 7 channels to 7 reservoirs. The earth trembled. Not here, everywhere, across all of Arion. In the capitals of the corporations, chandeliers shook. In the small principalities of the north, wells trembled. In the coastal villages, a blue light burst forth from beneath the sand. The 7 reservoirs opened simultaneously. The ether gushed forth, not in drops, not in liters, in rivers. Underground channels filled and overflowed. Capillaries that had been dry for 1,000 years flared up like the nerves of an awakening body. The ether rose to the surface, through the rock, through the soil, through the roots of trees that had drunk dead water for 10,000 years, through wells, through springs, through cracks in the rock. On the surface of the wastelands, grass began to sprout from the gray earth. Not stunted, green, strong. In a matter of minutes, the ash sank and life burst through it, as if the earth were remembering how to be alive. In the cavern, the walls glowed so brightly that Hiram shielded his eyes with his hand. Mira counted her pulse, her own. 120. Sora was crying, silently, with a smile. Evelyn stood with her mouth open, watching the stream of ether surging upward through the thin past them like a rising stream of warm air. Lena raised her hand. A spark at her fingertips flared so brightly that it lit up the entire dome of the cavern. She laughed. For the first time in a year, she truly laughed. June stood by the wall, silently, but her hand rested on the hilt of her sword, not for battle, for support, because her knees were trembling. Emma stood next to Caden. She looked at the river, at the light, at how the world was changing right now, right here, beneath their feet and above their heads, at the same time. Far beneath the ocean, the cocoon cracked. The sleeper opened his eyes, for the first time in 10,000 years. Caden felt it through the rock, a pulse, different, alive, not sleepy, alert, and a voice, not words, a sensation. Thank you. Caden opened his eyes. He looked at his people, at the old and the young, at the mages and the miners, at the warriors and the healers, at the cooks and the engineers, at everyone he had found and who had found him. Then he stood up. He wiped the blood from his face, picked up the pickaxe from the floor, and said that it was probably already getting light up above, and that he thought today would be a good day. They climbed for 2 hours. When they reached the surface, Caden stopped. The wastelands weren't gray. For the first time in 1,000 years, the land around Grey Rock was green. Grass, moss, young shoots of something resembling shrubs. The morning light fell on the dew-wet greenery and everything glowed. The sky was clear, no ash, no dust. Blue, with clouds, with real white clouds. 1,200 people stood in the city wall and watched, in silence. Some were crying, some were laughing, some were doing both. Hiram stood next to Caden, smoking his moss, silent. Then he said that this meant the end of the corporations, that if the ether is free, it cannot be controlled, that the world will change. Caden nodded, said it would change, and that it would be long and hard and painful, that the corporations would resist, that the devourers wouldn't disappear just because the ether had returned to the surface, that the sleeper had awakened, but he was alone, and the threat that had come 10,000 years ago might come again. Hiram asked, "So what now?" Caden looked east, toward where the sun was rising above the horizon. Pure, bright, real. He said that now we must build. Mines, roads, schools, hospitals, cities, for everyone, not for the corporations, for the people whom no one ever noticed because it wasn't profitable to notice them. Hiram snorted. He said that for a miner, Caden's speeches were too long. Caden replied that this was his last one, and that it was time for him to head to the mine. There was work to be done. He picked up his pickaxe, slung it over his shoulder, and walked toward the shaft. Emma followed him, then Lena, then Jaeun, then Evelyn with the blueprint, then Sora with a basket of food, then Mira with a tool bag. Then Hiram tapped his pipe on a rock and went too, grumbling that he was too old for this. But he went. 1,200 people watched as their lord and his team descended into the mine, on the first day of the new world, just like any other day. Because for Caden Worth, there was no difference between a day when the world changes and a day when you just have to dig. The work is the same. Look beneath the surface. Find what others don't see. Build so it won't collapse, and don't forget who you're doing this for. Theodore Grant deciphered the inscriptions and explained the mechanism for the cascading activation of the reservoirs. Caden led 3 expeditions and cleared the damaged channels. On the 360th day, he activated the system of 7 reservoirs simultaneously. Ether returned to the surface across all of Arion. The wastelands turned green. The sleeper awoke. Caden returned to work on the first day of the new world, ready to build on.